Welcome to the Week 2 podcast for PSHS 6240 here at George Washington University. Great discussions on Blackboard, really detailed. I think we got off to a good start for this week. So kudos to the effort there. And the more you put into it on Blackboard, the better your paper will be next week. And I'll give you an example paper in class this week as well. So, welcome to week 2. I hope everyone did the readings and watched the video. So I want to just cover a couple of key points for week 2. First, the 70s video, which covered kind of wave 3 of the waves of terrorism. And that video showed left-wing terrorism in Europe, some in the United States. Many probably didn't know the Capitol was bombed, the severe impact on civil aviation, the Munich attack that occurred. And what the takeaway from the show is the terrorists used the media of the day, which at the time, television, color television, 24-hour TV was starting to become more mainstream, or at least more relevant, and they used those examples use that media attention to get their narrative out, and that's what you saw really in the 72, the Munich attack. It was a media event, a media sensation, because that was the first time that you had the world's attention watching the Olympics, 24-hour media coverage, color TV. The terrorists knew that, and they knew they would get attention, and they did get attention, and they were rewarded. And that's kind of the takeaway from so many of the events that you saw in the 1970s documentary. So we then read the Hoffman and the 4 waves of terrorism, so the history of terrorism, and I'm going to go in a little bit of detail in class today. The 4 waves, again, the first wave was the anarchist wave. That was prior to, or up to, and a little past World War I, where terrorism was used as kind of an anti-government tool. And they used the media of the day, which at that time was daily newspaper circulation, to get their message across. Wave 2 was the post-colonial wave. Some of you might remember from high school history, most of the world was colonized prior to World War II. And after World War II, there was an intense decolonization phase, which was not nonviolent. It was violent in some respects and very violent in some respects as well. So that was kind of wave 2, and I'll come back to that in a second. Wave 3 was covered in the 70s documentary, which was left-wing terrorism, whether it was Palestinian terrorism or it was communist terrorism. That was kind of the waves of terrorism that occurred, again, from the late 60s to the 70s and 80s. And then wave 4 is the religious phase. That is Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which arguably occurs to this day. And again, the inspiration there is essentially religious-based terrorism, and the media of the use is the tools that we all use now, social media, YouTube, etc. Arguably, and it's not covered in the articles, we are now in the 5th wave of terrorism, and we'll cover that later in class, or in a later part of class, but this is kind of ethno-nationalist terrorism, or ethnic fascist terrorism might be a better way of putting it. And everything from right-wing extremism in the United States, culminating in the January 6th attack, right-wing extremism in Europe as a backlash to their immigration policies, or Hindu nationalism in India, or Burmese nationalism against the Rohingya. You can make those arguments that those are terrorist actions as well, or are part of a 5th wave of terrorism. So those are kind of the 4 waves plus 1 if we're talking about current day. We're going to go back and talk more in depth about 2 case studies, the Algerian case study, the FLN, and the Israeli case study, the Irgun, in depth. And as you're going through those, just imagine that, again, what were the causes, how do they achieve their objectives, and how do they use the media of the time to get their message across. So that'll be the kind of the first part of the class. The second part will be my favorite. What is terrorism? Based on your discussion board assignments. What is terrorism? What isn't? Why do we consider certain things terrorist and other examples not? And we're going to start off with, Dresden. Why do you think that was terrorism, or why do you not think it was terrorism? Most people said it wasn't terrorism, yet we killed lots and lots of civilians. And I will tell you that you'll have to ask, for those of you who said Dresden wasn't terrorism or wasn't a crime, you'll have to ask what's the difference between Dresden and what Putin's doing in Ukraine now with his aerial bombing. And I can tell you that the big difference is what Dresden was. Dresden would make Putin's attacks in Ukraine look like Club Med. Many more people were killed in Dresden, many more civilians, women and children. And the question is, why is that not terrorism? So that's just something I want you to think about. And then we'll talk about Fort Hood. We'll talk about Charlottesville, January 6th. Again, everyone I think said, or a vast majority said January 6th was terrorism. Not one person was indicted for terrorism of the 900 people that have been arrested in connection with January 6th. So you'll have to kind of square that peg for that argument. But what I really want to look at is the facets of terrorism. Why you thought certain actions, the criteria that said certain actions were terrorism and certain ones were not. And some of the ones that, again, I just saw in the discussion boards. Again, military versus non-military. Some people said that Fort Hood wasn't terrorism because it was a military target. Combatant versus non-combatant, which is a little bit different. But that is... some people said that the people at Fort Hood were not combatants because they were in an active war zone. Well, you got to tell me what an active war zone is. State versus not state. Attacking the apparatus of government. A political narrative. That might separate criminal activity from terrorism. Levels of oppression. We talked about last week. Certain people get to do certain things. Do certain groups get to engage in terrorism because they're so oppressed? I will let you decide on that, whether that's true or not, and what the level of oppression is. How are people associated with terrorism? Many of you said, well, the USS Cole bombing, he was associated with terrorism. Fort Hood, he was associated with a known terrorist. Well, what does associate mean? That's kind of a broad term. And then finally, one of you mentioned mental illness as a... you can't be a terrorist if you're a mental illness, if you're mentally ill. We can get into that debate as well in class. So we have lots of criteria to go through on what is terrorism, what is not. It's my favorite class of the year. We'll have a lively debate on it, and then we will wrap it up, and that will lead to your paper topic that is due next week. And I'll give you an example of that in class. So I'll see you guys next week, or I'll see you guys in class today. And don't forget, classes at 6:15. I'll see you at 6:15 today.